Universal Terror researchers discovered humans create fictional monsters worse than reality. Part 1. Dr. X had seen many terrible things in his career. As the chief researcher for the Galactic Registry of Dangerous Species, he had documented predators from 47 different galaxies. He had studied creatures with acid for blood, parasites that ate their hosts from the inside, and swarms that could strip a planet bare in days. He thought he had seen every kind of horror the universe could create. He was wrong. The mistake began with a simple assignment. The Galactic Council wanted to understand Earth better before allowing humans to join the wider community of spacefaring species. X and his team were supposed to study human culture through their digital archives. They would look at human art, music, history, and entertainment to understand what kind of species humanity was. The first few weeks went well. Humans seemed normal enough. They made beautiful music. They created stunning artwork. They told stories about love, adventure, and exploration. X began to think this would be an easy assignment. Then his assistant, a young named, found the horror section. "Dr. X," said one morning, his voice shaking slightly, "I think you need to see this." X walked over to his workstation. On the screen was an image from something humans called a movie. It showed a creature unlike anything in the registry. It had a long, curved head with no eyes. Its mouth opened to reveal another smaller mouth inside. Its tail ended in a sharp blade. According to the file, its blood was acid that could burn through metal. "Is this a species from Earth?" asked. "It's not in any of our databases." X studied the image carefully. The creature violated several laws of biology. The acid blood alone made no sense. How could a creature survive with acid flowing through its body? And the double mouth served no evolutionary purpose he could identify. "Run a cross-check with all known Earth species, extinct and living," X ordered. 10 minutes later, the results came back. No match found. "Check the database again," X said. "This creature must be from somewhere." Worked for another hour, expanding the search to include every planet humans had explored. Still nothing. "Sir," said slowly, "I think this creature doesn't exist. The file says it's from something called science fiction. It says the movie is a work of human imagination." X felt his three hearts skip a beat. "Imagination? You mean humans invented this?" "That's what the file says." X sat down heavily. He had spent 300 years studying real monsters. The idea that someone would invent one for entertainment seemed absurd. Why would any species do that? "What else is in this horror section?" he asked. Pulled up a list, the screen filled with titles. Alien, The Thing, Predator, Event Horizon, The Exorcist, Dead Space, 40K Resident Evil. The list went on and on. "There are millions of these," whispered. "Movies, books, games, stories. Humans have been making these for thousands of years." X felt a chill run through his body. "Open another file. Let's see what else they've imagined." The next file was worse. It showed a creature called the Thing. According to the story, it was an alien organism that could perfectly copy any living being it touched. It would absorb a person, learn everything about them, and then become them. No one could tell who was real and who was the Thing. It would spread silently through a population, replacing everyone one by one. X had to pause the file. His hands were shaking. In all his years of research, he had never encountered anything like this. A perfect mimic was every species' nightmare. It meant you couldn't trust anyone. Your friend, your family, your mate could all be replaced and you would never know. "This is brilliant," he said quietly. "Terrifying but brilliant. The Thing doesn't need weapons or armor. It just needs patience. How do you fight something when you can't tell who's infected?" "Sir, should we be watching this?" asked. His face had turned a pale blue, a sign of fear in the species. "We have to understand," X said. "If this is part of human culture, we need to know why." They continued their research. Each new discovery was worse than the last. They found cosmic horrors, creatures so alien that simply seeing them would break a person's mind. They found zombies, the dead rising to eat the living. They found vampires that looked human but fed on blood. They found werewolves that transformed under the full moon. They found the flood from a human game, a parasitic species that infected entire civilizations and turned them into mindless soldiers. Every story followed the same pattern. Humans would imagine something terrible, something that could kill them in horrifying ways, and then they would share it with each other for entertainment. They would watch these stories. They would read these books. They would play these games. And then they would go about their normal lives as if nothing had happened. X called an emergency meeting with his research team. 15 scientists gathered in the conference room. All of them looked tired. Several showed signs of stress. One researcher, a gentle named M, had requested psychological counseling after viewing something called the human centipede. "I don't understand," M said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why would they create that? What purpose does it serve?" "That's what we're here to determine," X said. He pulled up a presentation on the main screen. "We've now cataloged over 50,000 distinct horror creatures from human fiction. That's more than the number of actual dangerous species in our entire database. And humans invented all of them." "Perhaps they're warnings," suggested a military analyst. "Maybe these creatures existed long ago, and humans record them as stories to remember the danger." "We checked that," X said. "None of these creatures have ever existed. We've scanned Earth's fossil record going back 500 million years. We've checked genetic databases. These things are purely fictional." "Then they must be insane," another researcher said. "No stable species would do this to itself." X had considered that possibility, but everything else about humans seemed normal. They built cities, raised families, created art, and formed complex societies. They didn't act like a species in psychological collapse. "I have another theory," X said. "What if this is a survival mechanism?" The room went quiet. "Think about it," X continued. "Earth is classified as a Class 7 death world. The gravity is crushing. The weather is violent. The predators are among the most efficient killers we've documented. Humans evolved in an environment that was constantly trying to kill them." He pulled up an image of Earth highlighting the various dangers. Earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, floods, droughts, diseases, predators like lions, bears, crocodiles, snakes, sharks, and countless others. "Every other species from a death world developed physical advantages," X said. "Armor, claws, venom, speed. But humans, their bodies are weak. They have no natural weapons, no thick hide, no venom, so how did they survive?" He tapped his head. "They survived up here. Humans developed the ability to imagine threats and prepare for them. They could think about what might go wrong and plan accordingly. That's their evolutionary advantage." "But these monsters don't exist," protested. "Why imagine impossible threats?" "Because it trains the mind," X said. "If you can imagine a predator that's faster, stronger, and smarter than anything real, then real predators don't seem so scary. If you can imagine a disease that turns people into mindless cannibals, then real diseases are just another problem to solve." He pulled up more examples. "Look at how detailed these stories are. Humans don't just create monsters, they analyze them. They write about their weaknesses. They debate tactics for fighting them. They write scientific papers about fictional biology. They treat imaginary threats as if they're real problems that need real solutions." The research team studied the evidence. X showed them human online forums where thousands of people debated how to survive a zombie apocalypse. He showed them wikis documenting the behavior of creatures that didn't exist. He showed them academic papers analyzing the physics of fictional faster-than-light travel. "They're running simulations," said suddenly. "Combat simulations, survival scenarios. They're training themselves against impossible odds." "Exactly," X said. And they've been doing it for their entire history as a species. Every campfire story about monsters in the dark, every myth about gods and demons, every horror movie and scary book, it's all training. But training for what? M asked. X looked at the image of Earth on the screen. He thought about humanity's application to join the Galactic Council. He thought about all the real dangers that existed in space. Pirates, hostile species, cosmic radiation, vacuum, unknown diseases, first contact scenarios that could go wrong in 1,000 different ways. Training for survival, he said quietly. Humans are preparing themselves for a universe that wants to kill them. They just started preparing long before they reached the stars. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Finally, spoke up. Sir, what do we put in the report? X considered carefully. The Galactic Council needed to know about this. But how would other species react? Would they see humans as a threat? Would they fear a species that weaponized its own imagination? We tell them the truth, X said. Humans have spent millions of years preparing themselves for the worst possible scenarios. They've imagined every kind of monster, every type of threat, every way to die. And then they figured out how to survive all of it. He looked at his team. The question is, what happens when they meet a real monster? Part 2. The report caused chaos. X submitted his findings to the Galactic Council 3 weeks after beginning his research. He had expected questions. He had expected debate. What he didn't expect was panic. The council chambers erupted into shouting. Representatives from 30 different species demanded to speak at once. The delegate called for humanity's quarantine. The ambassador suggested humanity be classified as psychologically unstable. The representative fled the chamber entirely, claiming he needed to warn his. Order, the council speaker, an ancient named, slammed her staff against the floor. Dr. X will answer questions in the proper manner. The delegate rose first. He was a large being, nearly 3 meters tall, with soft gray skin and gentle eyes. His species had evolved on a peaceful garden world with no large predators. They were known throughout the galaxy for their kindness and wisdom. Right now looked terrified. Dr. X, he said, his voice trembling, are you telling us that humans deliberately expose themselves to psychological trauma for entertainment? That's one way to describe it, X answered carefully. But humans don't see it as trauma. They call it horror and they seem to enjoy it. Enjoy it, his voice rose. How can any sane species enjoy fear? I don't have a complete answer yet, X admitted. That's why I'm requesting permission to travel to Earth. I need to interview humans directly. Absolutely not, shouted the ambassador, a warrior named. His species came from a harsh world of ice and stone. They were strong, aggressive, and proud. This is clearly a military threat. Humans are training themselves for war. They're preparing to fight the entire galaxy. I don't think that's their intention, X said. Then explain this. Threw a data pad onto the council floor. A hologram projected upward, showing scenes from a human video game. Armored soldiers fought against insect-like aliens with energy weapons. Massive starships exchanged fire in space. Entire planets burned. This is what humans call 40,000, said. According to your report, they created an entire fictional universe where humanity is locked in eternal war against dozens of hostile species. They imagine fighting gods, demons, and cosmic horrors. They write books about it. They play games about it. They paint miniature soldiers and act out battles. He pointed at the hologram. These are not the actions of a peaceful species. These are war games, battle simulations. They're preparing to conquer the galaxy. Or preparing to defend themselves, X countered. Everything in my research suggests humans create these scenarios because they're afraid, not because they're aggressive. They imagine threats so they can prepare for them. The result is the same, said. A species that has spent thousands of years training for galactic war. The debate raged for hours. Some delegates wanted to deny humanity's application to join the council. Others wanted to study them further. A few species, particularly those from death worlds, seemed less concerned. The ambassador, whose species came from a tidally locked world of extreme temperatures, simply shrugged. Let them join, they said. If they've survived their imagination, they can survive reality. In the end, the council reached a compromise. X would be allowed to travel to Earth and conduct interviews. A small team would accompany him. They would have 6 months to understand humanity's relationship with horror. Then the council would vote on humanity's membership. 3 weeks later, X stood in the arrival terminal of Earth's primary spaceport. It was located in a city called Singapore, and it was unlike any place he had ever seen. Millions of humans moved through the terminal, talking, laughing, rushing to catch their flights. None of them looked dangerous. None of them looked insane. They just looked normal. His escort, a human diplomat named James, greeted him with a smile and an extended hand. X had learned this was a friendly gesture among humans. He carefully shook the hand, still getting used to how soft human skin felt. "Welcome to Earth, Dr. X," James said. "I understand you want to learn about our horror culture." "Yes," X said. "Your species has confused us greatly. We need to understand why you create such terrible things." James laughed. It was a warm sound, not threatening at all. "I think I can help with that. I've arranged several interviews for you. Authors, filmmakers, game designers, even some psychologists who study fear. But first, let me show you something." He led X through the city. It was a beautiful place, full of green parks and tall buildings. Humans of all types walked the streets. Children played in fountains. Elderly couples sat on benches feeding birds. It looked nothing like the nightmare world X had expected. "This is where you live?" X asked. "But in your stories, Earth is always shown as dangerous. Cities filled with crime, governments that fail, disasters waiting to happen." "Those are just stories," James said. "Most of human life is pretty normal. We go to work. We raise families. We meet friends for dinner. The horror stuff is just entertainment." "But why?" X pressed. "Why entertain yourselves with fear?" James thought about this as they walked. Finally, he stopped at a small and ordered 2 drinks. He handed one to X. It was something called coffee, and it smelled bitter but interesting. "Have you ever been truly afraid, Dr. X?" James asked. "Yes, when I studied the predators on Prime. They nearly killed me twice." "And after you survived, how did you feel?" X considered this. Relieved, grateful to be alive, stronger somehow. "That's what horror does for us," James said. "It lets us feel fear in a safe environment. We watch a scary movie or read a frightening book, our bodies react with real fear, and then it ends. The credits roll. We close the book. We turn on the lights, and we survived. We faced something terrible and lived." "But the threats aren't real," X said. "That doesn't matter to our bodies," James explained. "Our brains are very old, Dr. X. The parts that feel fear evolved millions of years ago when every shadow could hide a predator. Those parts don't know the difference between a real tiger and a fictional monster. They just know, threat detected, prepare to survive." He took a sip of his coffee. "So we watch horror movies. We read scary stories. We play survival games. And we train our brains to handle fear. When something really scary happens in real life, we're better prepared because we've practiced being afraid." Over the next few days, X interviewed dozens of humans. Each conversation taught him something new. A horror novelist named Sarah explained how she designed her monsters. "I think about what scares me most," she said. "Being alone, losing control, not being able to trust my own mind. Then I create a creature that embodies that fear. The is scary because it's a perfect predator and you can't reason with it. The thing is scary because it makes you paranoid. Zombies are scary because they're us, but wrong." "You deliberately create these fears?" X asked. Creating them helps me understand them, Sarah said. Once I write a monster, it has rules, it has limitations, it has weaknesses. That makes it less scary in a way. I've taken a formless fear and given it shape. Now I can study it. Now I can fight it. A film director named Washington showed X how horror movies were made. X watched actors pretending to be scared. He saw how special effects created monsters that looked real but weren't. He observed how music and lighting manipulated emotions. It's all fake, explained. Everyone watching knows it's fake. That's what makes it safe. You can experience terror without real danger. It's like riding a roller coaster. The fear is real, but you know you won't actually die. A psychologist named Doctor explained the science. Horror serves several purposes, she said. It helps us practice emotional regulation. It allows us to explore taboo subjects safely. It builds social bonds when we experience it together. And yes, it trains our threat response systems. She pulled up brain scans on her computer. When someone watches a horror movie, their brain activates the same regions as real danger. Heart rate increases, adrenaline flows, the fight or flight response triggers. But then the movie ends and the brain learns. You survived that fear. You can survive the next one too. So it's training, X said. In a way, yes, but it's also catharsis. Life has many real fears: death, disease, loss, loneliness. Horror lets us confront those fears in symbolic form. We can't fight death directly, but we can fight a vampire. We can't control fate, but we can survive a haunted house. The monster becomes a metaphor for our real anxieties. X spent weeks absorbing all this information. He watched horror movies with human volunteers and monitored their reactions. He read classic horror literature. He even played a survival horror video game, though he had to stop after an hour because his hearts were beating too fast. The game was called Dead Space and it terrified him. The player character was alone on a spaceship full of monsters. Every shadow could hide danger. Resources were scarce. Death was constant. And yet humans played this for fun. One of his research assistants had an emotional breakdown after viewing something called The Ring. He had to be sedated and sent home. But the humans who watched the same movie just laughed nervously and talked about how creepy it was. The difference was clear. Species from stable worlds couldn't handle human horror. It was too much for minds that had evolved in safety. But humans had evolved in constant danger. Their minds were built to handle fear because fear had kept them alive. X compiled his findings into a second report. He wrote, "Human horror fiction is not a sign of psychological instability. It is a highly sophisticated survival mechanism. Humans use imagination to prepare for threats before those threats arrive. They have been doing this for their entire evolutionary history. It is as natural to them as flight is to birds or swimming is to fish." He continued, "Moreover, humans have refined this practice to an extraordinary degree. They have created entire industries dedicated to manufacturing fear. They have developed detailed taxonomies of terror. They understand horror at a level no other species can match because they live with it every day." The report concluded, "Humans do not create monsters because they are violent or unstable. They create monsters because they are survivors. And after millions of years of practice, they have become very, very good at surviving." X sent the report to the council and waited for their response. He expected more debate, more fear, more calls for quarantine. What he got instead was an emergency. The message arrived at midnight, Earth time. X was asleep in his hotel room when his communicator began screaming alerts. He jolted awake and grabbed the device. The message was from Council Speaker. It was marked Urgent Priority 1. Dr. X returned to Council space immediately. "We have a situation. They have emerged." X felt his blood turn cold. They were a legend, a myth, a species mentioned in ancient texts but never confirmed. They supposedly came from dark space, the vast emptiness between galaxies. They were described as a swarm, a plague, a force that consumed everything in its path. "How bad?" X transmitted back. The response came instantly. 17 colonies lost in 4 days. We can't stop them. We need you here now. And Dr. X, bring a human. Part 3. They were worse than anything in the registry. X stood in the Council's military command center and watched the tactical displays with growing horror. Red markers showed fallen colonies. Blue lines indicated fleet movements, and spreading across the map like a disease was the swarm. They had appeared without warning at the edge of Council space. Scout ships reported a massive biological fleet moving faster than should be possible. When the first defense force engaged, they were overwhelmed in minutes. They didn't use weapons in any conventional sense. They infected ships, converting crew members into more. Then they used those ships against their former allies. Colony after colony fell. Each defeat made the stronger. They absorbed technology, adapted tactics, and spread like wildfire through Council space. "We're seeing complete fleet loss at first contact," Admiral reported. His species, were legendary warriors. They had never lost a war in their entire history. Now his voice shook with barely controlled fear. "Our soldiers panic the moment they see the. Half our crews refuse to engage. The other half die trying." X studied the tactical data. Then he pulled up his own files on human horror fiction. He scrolled through the database until he found what he was looking for. "They're like the flood," he said quietly. "What?" Admiral turned to him. "The flood, from a human video game called Halo." X pulled up images on the main display, parasitic creatures that infected other life forms, a hive mind that grew stronger with each victim, biological ships made from converted hosts. Humans imagined this 30 years ago. "So what?" snapped. "How does human fiction help us?" "Because humans also imagine how to fight them." X had brought Sarah with him from Earth. The horror novelist stood beside him now, staring at the tactical display with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear, not exactly, something closer to recognition. "You've seen this before," X said to her. "Not exactly this," Sarah replied, "but something like it. The flood. The thing. Humans have been writing about parasitic hive mind swarms for over a century. We've explored every variation of this nightmare." "Can you help us?" Admiral asked. His pride had evaporated in the face of extinction. "Please, we're losing this war." Sarah pulled out her data pad and started typing. "I need access to your tactical network, and I need to talk to your psychological warfare division. Now." Over the next 3 hours, something remarkable happened. Sarah, a civilian novelist from Earth who had never seen real combat, began restructuring the Council's military response. "Your soldiers are terrified because they don't understand what they're fighting," she explained to the gathered admirals. "Humans learned a long time ago that fear of the unknown is always worse than fear of the known. We need to make the comprehensible." She pulled up images of the from Scout recordings. They were horrifying creatures, twisted masses of infected flesh and chitin. They moved in ways that violated physics. They made sounds that hurt to hear. "Stop showing your soldiers these images," Sarah said firmly. "You're traumatizing them before they even fight. Instead, show them this." She pulled up a simple diagram. It reduced them to basic shapes and functions. Infection vectors, movement patterns, weak points in their armor, life cycle stages. "Make them boring," Sarah said. "Break them down into components. Give them categories. Make them predictable. Once you understand a monster, it's just another problem to solve." Admiral looked skeptical. "How can we make that boring?" He pointed at a replay of attack. The footage was nightmare fuel. "Watch," Sarah said. She muted the audio and slowed down the playback. "See, the infection requires physical contact. The infection process takes approximately 43 seconds. Infected hosts show delayed motor function for the first 6 minutes. After that, they're fully converted and combat-ready. She highlighted patterns in the footage. They use overwhelming numbers rather than tactics. They rely on fear to paralyze enemies. They prioritize high-value targets like bridges and engineering sections. Once you know the patterns, they're not mysterious. They're just another hostile force. "This is what humans do," Admiral asked quietly. "This is what we've always done," Sarah replied. "We take something terrifying and break it down until we understand it. Then we figure out how to kill it." The plan Sarah developed was simple but radical. Every soldier in the fleet would receive immediate psychological conditioning using human techniques. They would watch footage of but edited to remove the fear factor. Slow motion, clinical narration, focus on weaknesses rather than strengths. They would study human horror fiction to understand infection scenarios. They would practice containment protocols based on stories about zombies and alien parasites. They would learn tactical responses from human survival horror games. And most importantly, they would stop seeing thee as an unknowable cosmic horror and start seeing them as just another enemy. A dangerous enemy, but one that could be understood and defeated. X watched as the first training sessions began. Soldiers from dozens of species gathered to learn from human military advisors who had never fought a real war, but had spent years studying fictional ones. A human Marine Corps officer named Captain taught breach and clear tactics learned from horror games. "In dead space, you learn to control your fear," he explained. "You clear each room methodically. You watch your corners, you conserve ammo, you don't panic. The same principles apply here." A human CDC specialist named Doctor taught quarantine procedures based on outbreak scenarios. "We've modeled pandemic response for decades," she said. "Identify infected individuals, isolate them immediately, track all contacts, sterilize contaminated areas. These procedures work regardless of whether the infection is viral or parasitic." A human game developer named taught pattern recognition. "Enemies in video games follow behavioral scripts," he explained. "Once you learn the patterns, you can predict their actions. They do the same thing. They're following biological imperatives. Learn the pattern, exploit the pattern." The most surprising teacher was Sarah herself. She taught soldiers how to process fear. "You can't eliminate fear," she told a room full of terrified warriors. "Fear is a survival mechanism. It keeps you alert. It sharpens your reflexes. The trick is learning to function while afraid." She had them watch clips from horror movies, teaching them to observe their own fear responses. Heart rate increasing, breathing quickening, adrenaline flowing. Then she taught them techniques to control those responses, breathing exercises, focusing techniques, mental reframing. "You will be scared when you fight Sarah said. "That's normal, that's healthy, but you don't have to let fear control you. You can be afraid and still function. Humans do it all the time." X's assistant attended one of Sarah's sessions. He had barely recovered from watching The Ring. Now he sat among alien soldiers, learning how to survive actual horror. "I don't understand," said to X later. "How can they teach us this? They're not warriors, they're storytellers and entertainers." "They're survivors," X replied. "They've been training for this their entire lives. They just didn't know it." The first real test came 2 weeks later. A council fleet engaged a swarm near a colony world. Every crew had been through the human training program. Every soldier had studied the patterns. Every captain had a human advisor on their bridge. X watched the battle from the command center, his heart's pounding. This would either validate everything he had learned about humans or prove that imagination meant nothing against reality. They attacked with their usual overwhelming force, but this time the Council fleet didn't panic. Ships maintained formation. Soldiers followed quarantine protocols. Captains focused on tactical data rather than the horror of what they were fighting. When the boarded ships Response teams dealt with them using techniques learned from human zombie movies: headshots, fire, immediate containment. It wasn't easy. Casualties were heavy. But for the first time since the war began, a Council fleet held its ground. They didn't win, not exactly, but they didn't lose either. They fought to a standstill and retreated in good order. The second battle went better. The third better still. Within a month, the Council military had transformed from a terrified mob into an effective fighting force. Human tactics and human psychological training were distributed throughout the fleet. A human civilian named Emma Price proposed using what she called mimetic kill agents, based on something called the SCP Foundation. The idea seemed absurd, using information itself as a weapon, but when translated into practical technology, it proved surprisingly effective against the hive mind. A physicist named Doctor suggested quantum isolation fields based on a horror movie called Event Horizon. The movie was about a ship that traveled through hell. The science was fiction, but the concept was sound. Modified for real physics, the fields prevented infection by quantum-locking biological matter. Slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. 6 months after the first appeared, the Council fleet achieved its first major victory. They defended a colony world that should have fallen. They rescued civilians. They even captured specimens for study. Admiral contacted X after the battle. The old warrior looked exhausted but alive. "We won," said simply. "We fought monsters from dark space and we won, because humans taught us how." "Not because we're better warriors," X replied. "Because we're better students. We learned from humanity's millions of years of practice." The war continued for another year. They were eventually pushed back to dark space through a combination of human tactics, Council technology, and sheer determination. The cost was terrible. Billions died. Dozens of worlds were lost, but the Council survived. In the aftermath, everything changed. The Galactic Council offered humanity full membership with honors. They also created a new division called Theoretical Threat Response, with one purpose: imagine what could go wrong, then figure out how to survive it. Humans staffed most of the division. Horror authors wrote scenarios. Game designers created simulations. Scientists turned fiction into practical technology. The galaxy's best defense against cosmic horror became the species that had been scaring itself with imaginary monsters since it learned to tell stories. X published his final report 1 year after the war ended. It concluded, "Humanity's greatest weapon is not their technology or their courage. It is their imagination. They have spent millions of years preparing for threats that didn't exist yet. They turned their own fears into training exercises. They made horror into entertainment and entertainment into survival skills." When they emerged from dark space, they were not unprecedented. Humans had already imagined them, studied them, and figured out how to fight them. Not because humans are warriors, but because they are survivors who learned long ago that the best way to face the unknown is to imagine it first. The galaxy now understands what Earth's endless horror fiction really means. It means that whatever darkness lurks in the space between stars, whatever cosmic nightmares wait in the void, humanity has probably already imagined something worse. And they've already figured out 12 different ways to kill it. X sat in his office on the Council station, looking at Earth through the viewport. The small blue world seemed so peaceful from here, so harmless, but now he knew the truth. Earth wasn't a death world because it had dangerous predators. It was a death world because it had created the most dangerous species in the galaxy, one that could imagine any threat and learn to survive it. His communicator chimed. It was Sarah calling from Earth. "Dr. X," she said, smiling. "I just got the strangest commission. The government wants me to write scenarios about what could be worse than they're paying me to imagine new nightmares." "And will you?" X asked. Sarah's smile turned thoughtful. "Of course, that's what humans do. We imagine."